Exodus chapter 15 and verse 1, we read, "Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to the Lord and spoke, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank to the bottom like a stone." What an exciting, positive time we read about here. They had come out of Egypt. They had now crossed the Red Sea. They saw their troubles gone behind them. But things took a turn for the worse for Israel. They challenged God over whether he would care for them, whether he would provide the food and water they needed. They showed their ugly side, you might say, at Marah and in the wilderness of sin. Yet God continued to care for them. They vowed to obey God, and yet knowingly they defied him and worshiped a golden calf. In fact, 10 times we read in Numbers chapter 14, verse 22, Israel directly disobeyed God as he worked with them, guided them, instructed them until he finally had enough, and he barred them from entering the promised land. What was it that they were missing? They had good intentions. They had the legacy of being the people of the God of Abraham. They had been part of God's work. We find the answer in Deuteronomy chapter 5, if you turn there. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 29, we read as we break into the thought here, but let's just read what it says in verse 29 because it answers the question. "Oh, that they had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever." It was an issue of the heart. But what does that mean? How could they get from where they were, willing but weak, to this place of having a heart to fear and obey God with conviction and consistency? What was the process? What were the steps? Well, the key comes a few verses earlier. If we turn to the first part of the chapter 5 here in verse 1 then, we read, "And Moses called all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your hearing today, that you may learn them and be careful to observe them." Why make any effort to listen to God? I mean, God was their God. They grew up, you might say, in the nation of God. They knew God would take care of them. He'd shown that he would. But he said that you may learn them and be careful to observe them. In essence, God said to Israel, if you really want to please me, truly fearing me, truly obedient to me, you must be willing to become lifelong learners. And there's a lesson here for us. You see, this is exactly what Christ said to his disciples in Matthew 11. Let's go to Matthew 11. Matthew chapter 11. And we read here at verse 25, "At that time Jesus answered and said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you've hidden these things from the wise and the prudent and have revealed them to babes. Even so, Father, for so it seemed good in your sight. All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him." And then he says, verse 28, he says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So Christ said, come to me and I will give you rest. I'll give you peace, well-being. It comes from me and only from me. He said, take my yoke. In other words, apply yourself to the work that I am doing. And he said, learn from me, which would make a good title for the sermon, by the way. Particularly as it ties into the sermonette quite nicely. So you have that title. Our life is not just about getting up and making it through another day. It's not just making it through this week by our own intelligence, our experience, or maybe our good looks. You know, our life and our work should be the same. It should be congruent with the work that Christ is doing, the work that he is doing in us, the work of education. You see, education is not just preparing for life, education is our life. So that begs a question for you and me. Are we living a life of learning? To help answer that question, let's first review the 3 steps of learning that God has prepared for us. And if you want to think ahead as we go through this section, give some thought to how these 3 steps work as levers to move us closer to God, to having that heart to obey and that heart to fear God. So let's begin with step number 1. Part of the learning process always is and always will be. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4. As we look at the first of the 3 steps in the process, and we can see it exhibited through how God worked with Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 4, and he says, verse 9, only take heed to yourselves as Moses commands obedience of the people. We're picking up where we left off in the sermonette. He says, take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. And teach them to your children and your grandchildren. And then verse 10, especially concerning the day you stood before the Lord your God in Horeb, when the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, and I will let them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. If we go back to Exodus chapter 13, you might say we see the reference to what he was saying there in Deuteronomy chapter 4, because we do read about exactly what he was reiterating back here. Exodus 13 and verse 8, as he describes the Feast of Unleavened Bread and what it means to them, he said, verse 8 of Exodus 13, and you shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be a sign to you on your hand, and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. So what's the first step of learning? The first step of learning always is instruction or teaching, the transfer of knowledge. That has to be the first step. The why, as we were hearing about in this sermonette. God's working with Israel was based on the desire to give them knowledge. Why? So they would be a people that would, frankly, succeed, be successful, and have an accurate knowledge of the world around them. Not a knowledge filled with superstitions, not knowledge of a pantheon of gods that didn't exist, that were meaningless, but actually the knowledge of the reality of why we're here, the story of how we got here, and what our life is about. So God's working with Israel as he instructed them, and as we read this part of the Bible, we read about him doing just that, instructing, passing on knowledge, teaching, that first step of the educational process. We see that, for example, if you go back to Genesis chapter 18, this was by design. Genesis chapter 18, Genesis chapter 18 and verse 16, we read as we read what would happen to Sodom and what God explained would happen to Abraham. And he says, verse 16 of Genesis chapter 18, the men rose from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? And here we go, verse 19. For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him. I want Abraham to be the father of the faithful. I want him to establish a legacy of teaching and passing on the knowledge, the instruction of me and my ways to future generations. So I'm going to work with him. I'm going to instruct him. I'm going to make sure that he understands so he can establish that legacy. But it starts with instruction, doesn't it? It starts with teaching. As we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 1, we see that as Moses spoke to the Israelites before he died, he emphasized the importance of knowledge. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 9. And I spoke to you at that time, he says, as he recounts what he had done. He said, I alone am not able to bear you, and the Lord your God has multiplied you, and here you are today as the stars of heaven in multitude. May the Lord God of your fathers make you 1,000 times more numerous than you are, and bless you as he has promised you. He said, then how can I alone bear your problems and your burdens and your complaints? So he says, verse 13, so choose foolish, ignorant, and those people who don't know anything from among your tribes, and I will make them heads over you. Well, actually, that's not what he said at all, is it? What did he value? He said, choose wise, understanding, and knowledgeable men from among your tribes, and I will make them heads over you. And you answered me and said, the thing which you have told us to do is good. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and knowledgeable men, and made them heads over you, leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, 50s, 10s, and officers for your tribes. And he goes on from there. But the point was he was establishing as in positions of leadership men who had knowledge and understanding, had been instructed, had the capacity to learn and understand. A knowledge of their history. If you go to verse 19, you can see here, verse 19 down through verse 26, he goes on and he explains some of their history. So it needed to be men who understood the history of how they got there, the mistakes they made, and how God had worked with them, how they had defied God, how they had disobeyed, and how God had helped and been merciful upon them. And also recognition that this knowledge is by the revelation of God. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we'll read what I believe we read this in the sermonette. Let's come back to it again for a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 6, he said in verse 5, surely he says to the people, as we see in verse 1, as he was addressing Israel, surely I have taught you, verse 5, statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should act according to them in the land which you go to possess. Therefore be careful to observe them, for this is your wisdom. It was important that they have knowledge and know where that knowledge came from. Understand that the God of the universe was the one who was teaching them. And this was valuable because it came from God. And it held water. It was real. It worked. It would bring them success. But it was important that they knew where that knowledge came from. And as you look through Deuteronomy, frankly, you see different specific examples of knowledge, bits and pieces that we read through. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 17. We see an example of knowledge for a king. Deuteronomy chapter 17. And we read here in verse 14, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. And then we have some instructions about how he should conduct himself. But look what it says in verse 18. It says, also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests and the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes. You find this echo of what we read back in Deuteronomy as we began. So in other words, here's a specific example of specific people, in this case the king, the kings that would come along, and how they were supposed to be engaged in learning, specifically from the instructions of God's word. Instruction is important. Teaching is important. In fact, it's important enough that God comments, as we read the next chapter, on what not to learn. Chapter 18 and verse 9, when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. In other words, don't learn these things. Don't learn the superstitions. Don't spend your time dabbling in the ways and the ideas and the philosophies of the people around you. So he goes on and describes further what not to learn. Here, if we go to a few chapters down the road, Deuteronomy 31, obviously Deuteronomy is full of specific instruction for different scenarios. Teaching, understanding, the passing on, the transfer of knowledge from the book to the reader. We see Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 9. So Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses. So the Feast of Tabernacles, this year, on a regular cycle, here's what should be done. He says, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the stranger who is within your gates, that they may hear and that they may learn to fear the Lord your God. Here's this echo again. In other words, in order for them to learn, in order for them to be able to draw close to God and fear God, have a heart to obey God, you have to have the instruction. You have to have the transfer of knowledge. That has to be valued. And so much so that at the Feast of Tabernacles this year, in this 7-year cycle, they spent a chunk of the feast literally reading from the book of the law as people listened. Now, we might say we could do that in our day and age. During the feast, forget some of the other activities. Let's have a reading of the book of the law from start to finish. And you might say, well, what about, go-karting? And what about, going shopping? And what about the steakhouses or whatever else? Well, this would be very important. Now, we do have the advantage of having a book that we can have in our laps and read all year long, which they didn't have. So we can read the book all the time. But this is the value that was placed on instruction or teaching. It was so important that it was part of the holy days. Now, I mentioned earlier that God used a 3-part process of education in order to train the heart to draw near to God and to fear and love God and obey God. And I say that because God didn't just teach, he didn't just give knowledge. There's another part of education. There's another part of learning. And if we're going to learn from Christ, as he commanded us to do, as he emphasized to his disciples, then we're going to need to engage this part as well. Let's go back to Exodus 12, where we see it played out for us. Exodus chapter 12. And verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So as you start reading here about the time as they were preparing to leave Egypt, and in this case specifically about the Passover, we find that there's instruction that's passed on right away. Instruction about the calculation of this day. And frankly, how the calendar should be established. This month, this lunar cycle should be the first lunar cycle of the calendar that I'm going to use to establish these special days. So right from the get-go in this chapter, there's instruction. But he continues. This is verse 3. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons, according to each man's need. You shall make your count for the lamb. So we begin to bump into that second step in the learning process, which is training. Teaching comes first. Then training comes second. Doing the thing that was instructed. Because this is not just about listening and cognitively taking it in, knowing this fact or another. It's about doing what God says to do. So we find more instructions that required training, you might say, action. He says, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. So you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. So you see how God gave them things to do. There were instructions, but they had to be actually carried out in order to gain certainly the full weight of the lesson. But he was also employing this method of learning. That's very important for us, isn't it? You know, if you're going to teach well, if you're going to teach effectively, you need to be able to see that the audience, the learner, actually understands what you're saying. So for example, let's just do a little example here. I'm going to teach you how to speak Thai today, at least how to give a greeting. So the word I'm going to teach you is sawadee. Sawadee. Okay, sawadee, that's how it goes. Now, what I'd like you to do is to say it along with me together, okay? Again, I'll say it one more time, sawadee. Now, everybody all together, 1, 2, 3, sawadee. Again, please, sawadee. Excellent. Now, when I say 1, 2, 3, please go ahead and say that word. That means hello, greetings, and also goodbye. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Sawadee.
Again?
Sawadee.
I do, we do, you do. It's a teaching mechanism that actually helps the teacher to understand whether the learner understands or not. You all said it perfectly. So now you can speak Thai. If you ever go to Thailand, you now say, I know Thai, because I can say hello. And the people may begin talking to you, and you'll say, that's enough, I only know hello, okay, or goodbye. But that was literally exactly what God was doing with Israel. He was teaching them, but he was requiring that they do something. Why? Well, let's keep reading, and I think it'll become even more clear. Verse 7, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. They shall then eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, boiled, etc. Verse 10, let none of it remain until morning. Verse 11, eat it this way. But I want to focus on verse 12. He says, for I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And verse 13, now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not beyond you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now, I have a question for you. Was the blood outside the house a marker so the death angel and God ultimately know where the Israelites lived? Now, if that's the case, can God not see through walls? Did he not know where the Israelites lived? Was this like a signpost so he could follow his way? Oh, there's an Israelite. There's another one. Was that what that was about? Not at all, was it? What was it about? It was about obedience, wasn't it? So it wasn't to show the way, it was to show obedience. That's training. Because by obeying, they were actually exercising obedience. They were putting their knowledge, and ultimately, fundamentally, or most fundamentally, you might say, is a willingness to obey. They will put it into practice, which is important, isn't it? Because if we learn to obey and we put it into practice, we develop ultimately a heart to obey. Because we're willing, when we know that this is the God of the universe and he's instructing us and guiding us, we are willing to do what he says. We respect what he says. We honor what he says. And what happens is it's a snowball effect that affects every aspect of our life. This was about obedience. And so training is very important as the second stage, as the second part of learning. But there's also a third component to learning. Teaching, training, and then the third part is testing, isn't it? Testing. Let's go to Exodus 15, just a couple chapters later, where we see in Exodus 15, as the children of Israel approached Marah, verse 23, when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. And when he cast it into the waters were made sweet. And there he made a statute. And you may have noticed this, reading this before, but what does it say next? And there it says, an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. Tested or proved, like proving a yoke of oxen. A test drive, a practice run, like a golf swing. Here last week, some of the students and my wife and I went to Topgolf to hit some golf balls. At least some people hit the golf balls, some people, swung at air. But when you're getting ready to hit a golf ball, right, what do? You step back a little bit and you take a swing. Okay, that's good. Another practice swing, that's good. And then if you're like me, you step up to the ball and you miss it. But the idea is that you actually, those practice swings, they help you to get your swing in gear, so when you actually are trying to hit the golf ball, you hit it nicely. That's what we do in all kinds of different types of sports or types of activities. We have a practice run, a test run, you might say, to act out, to practice the activity. Here, what God was doing was he was testing them to see if they learned, give them an opportunity to do what? To obey him, to look to him, to have the confidence that he would solve their problems, that he would come through and he would provide for them. He had before, hadn't he? And we see how he brought them out of Egypt. But had they learned? There's nothing like being given instructions for a new and complicated test, or task, I should say, and then having the boss walk away for our test. And not giving us the training that we need. Both the instruction and the training is important so we can do the test properly, isn't it? When I was a teenager, I worked at Bob Barthel's fruit farm. And we had strawberries, and we had apple trees and pears, and we had some cherry trees. It was about, I think it was about 45 or 50 acres of strawberries that were pick-your-own strawberries. So we had Those of us who are the grunt staff, we weeded strawberries, we hoed strawberries, we picked rocks, we did all kinds of stuff with the strawberries, and we thinned apples and all kinds of things. But one day, during the middle of the strawberry picking season, I and a few of the other guys, we were out weeding and such, and we also, because it was pick your own, the people would come, they'd park, and then they'd go and you direct them where to pick the strawberries, and you mark where they end, and so on. Well, this day, things were sort of tailing off in the afternoon, and so my boss, Bob Barthel, he comes by and says, John, he says, come with me. I need you to fill in. One of the girls at the cash register, who's at the little shed where the people check out, has to leave, and we don't have anybody else to fill in for her. In fact, everybody's gone. This is just the afternoon. Can you come in and fill in? And I said, okay. Little did I see the storm clouds on the horizon. So I go, and he says, okay, here's what you do. Here's a little adding machine. You do this, plus this, and then, pops, the roll comes out, and it's a record of what's happening and all that. I said, okay. And he was gone, and he left. I'm looking at this adding machine, and I'm thinking, now, what did he say? Which button went where? Now, any of you have ever worked at adding machine, it's not as easy as it might seem, especially when it's a record-keeping role for the IRS, as Bob explained to me the next morning very clearly. Because what happened was, I started hitting the numbers as customers were coming through, and then I realized I hit a wrong button, and then I backspace, and I undid that and deleted and undid that. Finally got to the point I just sort of closed the whole thing and put it away as people were gone, and I hope this all works out okay. Next morning, I'm minding my own business, thinning apples in the apple orchard, just watching the clouds go by until Bob appears on the horizon. We had a little Datsun pickup truck. He comes driving up to me in the orchard, slams on the brakes, skids about 10 feet, jumps out of the truck, doesn't even slam the door, walks up to me and says, "What's this?" And it's this roll of adding machines, stuff. He says, "How am I going to explain this to the IRS?" I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I don't think you're ever going to do the adding machine again in the checkout process. You're not smart enough to do that." I was, okay. I couldn't argue with him at that point, could I? I mean, really, it was what it was. Did I learn a lesson that time? I should have stopped and said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you train me again? So when I'm tested on it, I know what I'm doing." It's hard to be tested without having the training, but God gives us lots of training, doesn't he? He gives us lots and lots of training, so when we're tested, we know what we're being tested on, and we know if we need to learn again. God doesn't make life non-testing. He actually builds tests in the process. And if we go to the next chapter, what's really neat about this is we see it all come together. So let's read chapter 16, because in chapter 16, we see, as we set the stage in verse 1, we see how these three steps all come together in chapter 16 for us. Chapter 16 and verse 1, they journeyed from Elam, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elam and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. And we see the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate bread to the full. For you brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." So here's the setup. We see, verse 4, the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." So I'm going to test them whether they have been listening and the training has worked, and whether they will obey me, whether they'll do as I instruct. So he says, verse 5, "And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily." So now verse 6, here's the instruction to the people. Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. But what are we that you should complain against us? Verse 8, this shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. And what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. Verse 9, say to all the congregation of the children of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your complaints. Now it came to pass, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. So this was quite a dramatic moment. God appeared to them, and God gave them very specific instructions. And so then we come to let's jump down to verse 16, in regard to the manna. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. He says, now this is going to be the training, okay, the backdrop, the fundamental instruction we've covered, and now he's going to give specific actions that are going to provide a training mechanism, something to do. And so verse 16, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it, that is the manna, what is it? Verse 16, according to each one's need, 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons, let every man take for those who are in his tent. Then the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less, and we see they had all they needed. Verse 18. And then verse 19, Moses said, let no one leave any of it till morning. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. So they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need. When the sun became hot, it melted. So we see, not only did he say, what is the fundamental point here? It's certainly obedience to God. Will you obey me so I can provide for you, or will you not? But you might say, built on top of that was what? The principle, the law of the Sabbath day, of keeping the Sabbath day. But what training mechanism did he put into place to help them to learn about it? The manna. So they go every day, and 6 days they're to take it. There's a little bit of an instruction. Look, do it the way I say. When it comes to the Sabbath day, though, he says, verse 23, he says, because they were supposed to gather twice as much on the 6th day. Verse 23, he said, this is what the Lord has said, tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. So they laid it up until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Then Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. So the Sabbath, you might say in that regard, was the test, wasn't it? Would they obey what he said? This training, teaching, training, and then a test. Because if they didn't do as he said and gather twice as much on the 6th day, they'd have nothing to eat on the Sabbath day, right? And if they tried to go out on the Sabbath day, there's none to find. So you see how God, in this one chapter, we see how these 3 principles of learning, these 3 steps of learning are laid out for us as they were for the Israelites. And as we see in chapter 16 in verse 31 and 32, well, verse 30, so the people rested on the 7th day, and the house of Israel called its name manna, and it was like white coriander seed, and the taste of it, well, it was like wafers made with honey. And then Moses said, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Fill an omer with it to be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so they got to live through 40 years of teaching, training, and testing with the manna. So if you've been thinking ahead, what have you come up with in terms of application? How do we apply this truth that part of God's work, part of Jesus' specific, enunciated by him, work is to teach, train, and test you and me? How do we apply that? Well, the Sabbath is a great one to think about right away, isn't it? Since we've just been talking about the Sabbath in regard to ancient Israel. Whether we're called into the church as adults or grow up in the church, we learn about God's Sabbath day. We're taught, for example, we're given instruction about the Sabbath day, when it begins, when it ends, what we're supposed to do, what we're not supposed to do, what it represents, how it benefits us. We learn from Genesis chapter 2 in verse 2 and 3. On the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done. So we begin to learn from the first pages of the book about the Sabbath day. And then we learn more specifics, don't we? We go to Exodus chapter 20, and we read how he says in verse 8 and 9 and 10 and 11, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is holy to God. So don't work on that day. So we realize, okay, not only is it holy, but it's a day in which we do not do our normal work. And then in Leviticus chapter 23, as chapter 23 begins, before we even get to all the plan that's shown through God's holy days, we're instructed that on the Sabbath day there's to be a holy convocation. So we learn more about the Sabbath and how the specifics of how the Sabbath works and what we're supposed to do and not do. And then if we go to Isaiah chapter 58, we read as we learn about the Sabbath day, we learn of a principle that underlies how we observe the Sabbath day. As we train and as we implement the Sabbath day in our weekly life, you might say. Isaiah chapter 58, we have this principle that we learn, verse 13, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable. In other words, we don't do all of our own things. We create a separation. We don't dishonor the Sabbath day by putting our foot on it, the lowest part of our body, which is more, frankly, it's more clear in different cultures where that's more of an issue. You know, in Asia, for example, showing the sole of your foot to somebody or pointing that at them is very repugnant. It shows a dishonor. In our country, we're not quite so, I guess we don't quite those things don't mean as much, but it is something I certainly learned in Thailand. The foot is the lowest part of the body, and it shows dishonor to put your foot on something. And so this is what he's referring to here. He says, if you will turn away your foot from the Sabbath day and call the holy day of the Lord a delight and honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. So we have a principle that we can train with every week, because we bump into situations often where we have to decide what do we do or not do. And that's training, isn't it? It's just like a game situation. When you get into a game, even practice games, you're learning how to deal with different situations. And so we train all the time. We continue as we go in the New Testament, where we see Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, how Christ worked with his disciples in this training process. Because Mark chapter 2 and verse 23, they were walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, verse 23, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Not according to God's laws. You don't read this in the Pentateuch. We don't read this among the statutes. It was laws, they were laws that they were referring to that they had added in very specific detail about what you can and you can't. Christ was teaching them two things. One, they're not the authority on right or wrong and what can be done and cannot be done. And secondly, there's a principle involved here that I want you to learn principles so you can be able to, from the heart, learn to keep the Sabbath day and ultimately, more importantly, to honor me and fear me. So I'm not going to define it in every little detail. And so he says, verse 25, he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, and he and those with him? And he actually recounts a situation and the lesson, verse 27, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a part of an exercising process so that we can learn to love and fear God. It's made for us, for our benefit, for our instruction, our training, and sometimes we're tested on it as well, aren't we? Sometimes we have our moments where we are tested. By the way, if you go to Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24, when it comes to holy convocations that we're commanded to take part in, the Sabbath, as I said back in Leviticus, is mentioned as one of those. Hebrews chapter 10, as we layer another principle as to how to keep the Sabbath day and train in the keeping of the Sabbath day. Hebrews chapter 10, we read verse 24, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. When do we assemble ourselves together? One of the ways is on the Sabbath day. It's a commanded holy convocation. So to the best of our ability, unless we're literally unable to be there because of our infirmity of some type or another, we just simply cannot. We are commanded to be part of the convocation and assembly. And so it is part of training, because there might be days where we feel like, I feel a little bit like I just could use a little bit more of a break today. And when I hang around those church people, it's pretty mentally exhausting. I've got to talk and smile and all those hard things. I literally had somebody tell me one time, look, I feel like I can get more out of the Sabbath if I stay home and just study. I learn more than when I'm with those people at church if I just engage in a study project myself. I'm thinking to myself, really? Whoa, that's ripe. That is, you're saying disobeying God's command about a holy convocation is less important to you than what you think you can somehow get out of the Sabbath by disobeying one of the principles or one of the instructions about the Sabbath? Okay, that's an interesting approach. I can't condone it. That may be your thought and your opinion, but that's not biblical. Part of the training is actually moving ourselves to come back again together so we can actually observe this holy convocation. And we are tested, aren't we? We are tested. I'll just refer you to Nehemiah chapter 13, because it would take some time to go through it. I wanted to go through it, but it's what I would say you might call our own Nehemiah situations. Nehemiah chapter 13, you see how Nehemiah says, in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes and figs and all kinds of burdens which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And then it says, I warned them about it. He has to figure out what to do, how to deal with the fact that the Sabbath was being broken. And it wasn't as if they didn't know, because if you just look back to Nehemiah chapter 9, he says, you made known to them your precepts, your holy Sabbath. You commanded them. And then in Nehemiah chapter 10, we see that they make this commitment, this verbal commitment to obey God. And here a couple chapters later, they're just ignoring it. Some of the people are just ignoring it. So these situations come up, don't they? Where we have to consider how do we keep the Sabbath? How do we view the keeping of the Sabbath? And we can be tested as well in one way or another. It's not just the Sabbath, however. We need to be able to see the learning cycle in everything that we're doing. Because God is applying this teaching, training, testing pattern in every aspect and at every stage of our life. And our testing never ends. Patience, joy, long-suffering, love, mercy, forgiveness, repentance. Does the testing and the training and the learning, does all of that ever end? You may have heard if you don't pass the test, you'll have to do it again. Well, that's true, but there's more. Here is a wake-up call. In case you hadn't noticed, when it comes to life's tests, if you do pass the test, you can be sure that you'll still get to do it another time. You know how I know that? Because I'm alive. And I find that my patience is tested today just like it was when I was 13, right? In different ways. And I'll bet for each of you, if you think of your own life, is there anything in your life where, let's say, for example, you can say, I passed the patience test. I am so glad because I will never have to be patient again. Whew! I passed the forgiveness test. I can forgive somebody. I'm sure glad I won't have to do that again. I passed the joy test. I have joy today. I'm sure glad I never have to have joy again in my life because that's hard to have joy. That's ridiculous, isn't it? In other words, every aspect of our learning that God is bringing us through, He teaches, He trains, and He tests. And the tests that we have when we're 60 or 70 are different tests than we have when we're 10 or 11 or 12. But they're still tests that help us to understand more deeply patience, joy, long-suffering, mercy, godly love, whatever it might be. Because that is a life, if we are living a life of learning. Now, if we've stopped learning, and if we're simply treading water, well then, okay, fair enough. You may not feel like it's important to actually go through a test and learning more about patience or whatever it might be. But if we're living a life of learning, well, then it's going to last, and it's going to continue up until our last breath. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. That's what makes life fulfilling. That's what deepens, and that's what matures us. So we ultimately can take on the mind of God, and we can more and more be congruent with with loving God from the heart, as Christ loves us. You know, we can see if we look at the example of Peter, for example. Let's go to John chapter 13. John 13. We can see our own life mirrored in a way, I think. As we see how Christ brought Peter through this lesson by instruction and then training, testing, and then we see a result. John chapter 13. This powerful lesson, John chapter 13, and verse 36, Simon Peter said to Christ, Lord, where are you going? Verse 36 of John chapter 13, where I am going, you cannot follow me, but you shall follow me afterward. Verse 37, Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. And Jesus answered him, this is the teaching, now this is the instruction, will you lay down your life for my sake? In other words, he planted a seed that maybe his confidence was greater than truly his character. That's instruction. Sometimes instruction comes in just a seed that's planted in our mind, where we think about something, isn't it? It's not always necessarily so, classroom style. He planted the seed that was clearly remembered as time went by. He said, will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Can you imagine what Peter was thinking at that point? What? How can this be? I've shown you over the last 3+ years that I am faithful and loyal to you. It's because he did not understand himself as well as he thought he understood himself. And isn't that the way it is with us? Because we haven't plumbed the depths of our learning experience. Now, as we go through the account here, we look forward to John chapter 18. John chapter 18, and we see in verse 15, how the words that Christ said came to pass. Simon Peter, verse 15 of chapter 18, followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And we see how they came and they were then recognized by others. He said, the servant girl, verse 17, who kept the door, said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." And he repeated this twice again. The lesson was deeply impressed on him through this training mechanism that was orchestrated, a powerful training mechanism. When he was put to the test, ultimately, what would he do? But here's the neat thing about life. Here's the neat thing about the learning process. We get do-overs. We get to learn again. We get to train further, and we get to confront that test again. We get to go up to bat again. Even if we struck out last time, we get to go up to bat again and give it another try. We get to go up to that golf ball, and we get to try to hit it again, right? That's the way God works. And when we go to Acts chapter 2, we see Peter shine. This time he learned, and we see in Acts chapter 2, if you go there, you see he's a different person, which is what happens when we learn. When we learn, we actually become a different person. And we would hope as Christians that we draw closer to God. We have a heart towards God that is deeper and more convicted than we did last week, or the week before, or the year before. Where we see here Peter, when he was put to the test, in this case, when he was put on the spot, he said to the crowd assembled before him, "Men of Israel," verse 22, "hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God." And I can just see him pointing a finger. I can just see him pointing that finger directly in their face and saying, "You have crucified and put to death." Because that was the conviction that he was showing. This was a do-over, and this time he knocked it out of the park, didn't he? He learned, and he went through the process of training, and he understood better than he did before, and he was a more convicted man. What a powerful lesson Peter learned and taught and trained and tested through this process. Christ taught and trained and tested him. Not only is God guiding us through a life of learning, but here's the inspirational thing to me, and that is that God is also teaching us as a body. Do we not, as a congregation and as a church, do we not grow? Do we not learn lessons so that as we go year in, year out, we're actually becoming, we would hope, through the lessons that we learn, drawing closer to God, not just individually, because it's not just about us. It's about us as a congregation, as a church, together actually learning, being instructed, training. Think about what's happened over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. Have we gone through training, especially those of you brethren who have been around for 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years? Has there been training? You better believe it. Has there been testing? You better believe it. And have we learned from it? I would hope so. I think we have. I think we have. Does it mean that the learning, testing, training, those three, learning, training, testing is done? I don't think so. But it has been part of the experience of the church. And God is testing us and training us and teaching us as a people. Isn't that what 1 Corinthians chapter 12 is all about? When we read, when one member suffers, all the members suffer with it, because we're in this together. If one member is honored, then all the members rejoice with it, because we're learning together. So, let me conclude with an action step. What do we do about this? Well, let me ask the question, are we engaged? Are we taking advantage of our customized GEP? That stands for God's Educational Program, by the way. Are we engaged taking advantage of God's educational program that He is working in our life? If so, then what have you learned this year? What have you learned over the past Holy Day season, this year, over the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, last great day? What have you learned? Could you write something down that you've learned? What have you learned today? Because you and I, we have been in the classroom. We have been taught. And you have trained through the keeping of the Sabbath and the holy days and every other situation that challenges us to apply the mind of God. And we will be tested as to what we've learned, whether we've learned. If needed, God will provide more teaching. If needed, God can and will provide more training. And you can be sure that God will provide the testing as well. Isn't that what 1 Peter chapter 4 is about? 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4. And verse 12. Beloved, 1 Peter 4 and verse 12, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing had happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part He is blasphemed, but on your part He is glorified. But let none of you suffer. In other words, the test should not be about sinfulness or disobedience to God, as we read in verse 15. Yet if anyone, verse 16, suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. Verse 17, for the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. You might say, testing, which includes teaching, includes training as well as that testing. We don't get tested without the first two. That's not the way God works. And we see it through the pages of the Bible. We see it through the story of the Israelites. Teaching, training, and testing. The time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? So, how do we respond to God's teaching, training, and testing, His learning program for us? Will we learn? Will we dig in our heels? And will we stay stagnant? The question is for us. Will we put our head in the sand and say, in essence, I'm okay as I am. Don't prod me or don't poke me in an area that I really don't want to change, because I'm okay with that. That's just the way I am. That's just my personality. That's just me. Is that the way we are? Or are we moldable and shapeable by God? Will we recognize how good God's teaching and training and testing is for us? Or will we harden our hearts? Will we become discouraged and weary in doing well? Or will we live a life of learning as Christ desires for us? Let's go to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. Where we began. Matthew chapter 11, and we read verse 28. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I'll give you rest. I'll give you contentment. Why? He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. In other words, part of the work that Christ is doing, that's what a yoke symbolizes, doesn't it? It symbolizes work. Part of the work that he is doing is helping us to grow and learn. And if we can actually jump in together, if we can work together with him on what's important to him, which is our learning process, then what we're doing is we're on the right page. We are, in essence, as I said, becoming part of and being a partner in the effort that is important to him, which is our growth. For I am gentle and, verse 29, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Learn from me. That's what Christ said, and that's our challenge if we are intent on drawing close to God and living a life of learning.